First came the tax cuts, then came the budget crunch. Now Governor Maura Healey has to cut state spending to make up for it. Just a few months after Healey signed the first big tax break package, Massachusetts has seen in 2 decades, state revenue is coming up short. Projections put the state in the red by as much as $1 billion. To close part of that gap, the governor's announced $375 million in budget cuts, and critics on the left and the right are saying they raised questions about other choices that are being made on Beacon Hill. Joining me to weigh in on both rounds of cuts and their bigger implications are Doug Howgate, he's president of the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, and Jonathan Cohn, policy director for Progressive Mass. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
So, Doug, for people who might not be familiar with the state budget and the state budget process, why is the governor making these cuts mid-year, and what in particular is she cutting?
Sure. So, great question. So, when the budget is signed into law at the start of the year, from that point on, in the fiscal year, it's up to the administration to certify throughout the process that we still have the revenue to support the spending that we've committed to. And so oftentimes, starting in October, but oftentimes in January, you'll see the administration come in and say, you know what, we've looked at the revenues that we've collected to date, or we've looked at our spending obligations, and we need to adjust our revenue projections upward, as was the case in a couple years, notably recently, or downward. So in this case, Governor Healey has adjusted those revenue collection expectations by $1 billion, and then under law, she basically has to balance the budget, right, to make sure that we continue to have a balanced budget for fiscal year 2024, which is the fiscal year we're in right now.
Okay, what, briefly, and then we'll get you in here, Jonathan, I promise, what is she cutting?
Yeah, so $1 billion revenue downgrade, right? And what the administration has put out there is about $675 million of other revenues that they think can close 2/3 of that gap. And then there's about $375 million of spending reductions. What I think is really important for folks to know, though, is the spending reduction is not the same as a programmatic cut. What do I mean by that? So as you look at what she has done, there's kind of a few areas of focus. So one is programs that haven't seen the utilization that they expected at the start of the year, so it's not going to cost as much as we thought it was going to cost. That's been an area of focus. A place where
mass health, right?
Yep, and in some other areas as well. There's also been some programs where there are other sources of funding, whether federal or other state programs, that can offset budget appropriations. She's reduced some spending there. There are also some places where there are programs or personnel where they're delaying the implementation of a new program expansion or other changes. Those are kind of 3 of the key areas, as well as some other cuts to local programs called earmarks and things like that.
All right, Jonathan, let's get you in here. You put out what I thought was a really strikingly tough statement about the governor's cuts, and I believe we have it and can pull up the text. So you wrote, and this is part of it, the heart of it. Last year, advocates repeatedly stressed that now was not the time for permanent tax cuts. The signs of lower revenue collection were already coming. The legislature refused to listen and instead passed a tax cut package that included regressive tax cuts almost equivalent in size to these draconian cuts, referring to what the governor has just done. It should not be lost on us that we never see emergency pauses of regressive tax giveaways. The solution is always one that falls on the backs of the poorest. Would you like to see the governor pausing those tax cuts here? Do you believe that that's the solution?
So I would say, I wouldn't say that's like necessarily specifically those, but there should be, like, that you should raise money back, right? So whether that's pausing some of the tax cuts that particularly benefit higher income individuals, let's say like delaying implementation of the estate tax changes, which I don't support even existing from that. You could like pausing that, or even looking to see other ways of raising revenue. One of the big problems that I saw with the tax package last year, beyond the fact that about 1/3 of it disproportionately benefited those who have the highest incomes or large corporations, is that it was a net revenue loss for the tax package. That you could have done something revenue neutral or revenue positive to make sure that any changes that kind of did benefit middle and lower income taxpayers, residents of the state, were paid for, and so that we would still end up on a sound fiscal basis. That one thing that I think of with this is that there was a study like only a few years ago that we spend about $1 billion each year in various tax incentives to specific industries. And things like that, whether it's targeting some of those to pause them or even to just simply reevaluate if they're even delivering. is something to me makes sense rather than making cuts.
I want to ask you to elaborate, and then I'll come back to you. But you use the term. Well, let's make it a dual thing. I'll sort of both you. You use the term, Jonathan, draconian to describe the cuts. The description that you offered didn't sound draconian at all. So let's try to hash out. What do you see that merits the use of that adjective?
So the parts that I would target the most are the things that are delays of program expansion, which Doug had noted, that particularly because the people who benefit from those are people who have the least. So one of the things that got cut there was expansions of welfare benefits for for the neediest families in the state. And when you have individuals who have very little to begin with, and they're seeing a loss in state support at the same time that the state thinks it's okay to give a $99,600 tax cut to a multi-million-dollar estate, to me that seems like kind of a misalignment of basic priorities. That in some other programs where it's just like less...
I was going to say, just give me one more, and then we'll get right back in here.
Is what I often think of when it comes to, let's say, if things aren't being utilized to the extent predicted. To me, it's not clear that the state is even doing the outreach necessary to reach the full utilization. Since there are many people who don't even know that they have access to programs, and I always like to look at spending from the perspective of of our needs being met.
That's a good point. It's not necessarily a perfect system with everyone fully informed. Okay, what do you say in response to Jonathan's objection?
Sure. So a couple things. So one, I think it's important for folks to know the fiscal year 2024 budget, so the fiscal year we're in, spending grew year over year by 7% in the budget that Governor Healey signed. With these 9C reductions, they're called, spending will grow at more than 6%. Historically speaking, that's a very high rate of spending growth. So, for example, in the 3 years prior to the pandemic, average annual spending growth was 2.9%, right? Now, you could argue whether 2.9% is right or wrong, but 7% this year, 8% last year, those are historically high levels of spending growth. Now, they did a lot of things, right? They included universal school meals, implementation of the Student Opportunity Act. So I think you continue to see a budget this year that has huge expansions in areas like housing, K-12, early education. And two other things I would just note quickly. So in terms of the benefit pause on welfare families, I think one of the things that is so challenging about balancing the budget, about achieving our fiscal goals, whether it's now and going forward, is how you manage all these priorities, right? And we've seen 3 consecutive years of benefit increases for welfare families, which I think the Healey administration, House and Senate, are understandably very proud of, right? Those benefits have grown by about 33%. I think the challenge the Healey administration had was we're about to kick off the FY25 budget planning process. This benefit increase was going to go into effect in April, and so the cost this year also has a large cost next year unless you're going to start the new benefit and then cut it back again. And so I think one of the things you're seeing in terms of the plan as well is pressing pause on some of those things as we start our budget development process for next year as well. And then one thing I would just say very quickly, and then happy to get to the discussion, is on the tax front, I think that where we think it's critically important and why we think the tax package that was signed into law in October is so important is we need to manage our finances now, make critical investments in whether it's our labor force, housing system, K-12 system. We also need to think about some of the challenges Massachusetts has. And as you mentioned, the first major tax changes in 20 years, I think reflective of a lot of elements of the tax code that really haven't had the adjustments they've needed as we've seen major changes to our economy and the economy that our residents are living in.
Jonathan, I'm wondering, Doug mentioned that they're going to be getting ready to do the next budget cycle. We've had, I believe, is it 6 months of tax receipts coming in short?
Where there's benchmark, yep.
So what I'm wondering is, do you think, and then I'd be interested in your take too, does that suggest that the model that the people who put the budget together are using is maybe in need of some adjustment? Are they making fundamental assumptions that they shouldn't be making? Or, and I ask that as someone who doesn't fully understand the process.
I will say, I don't know. I can't say that I know the full details of the modeling that they use, and I think that often with that there can be economic changes to the overall economy that are not reflected in it, and they need to readjust. The main thing that comes to my mind is if the revenue projections are down, one that underscores the point that I noted before that that's not a good time for reducing overall revenue, and that there needs to be real attention to how to make sure that we're able to do everything in the budget that we need to do, because even though that the budget has grown in recent years, as long as we still have high income inequality in the state, that there are still a number of people who are struggling to get by. We have some of the most expensive child care in the country in Massachusetts.
We do.
And many people who are at risk of displacement if they haven't already been displaced from Boston out to like the South Coast, out to Rhode Island, that we have a lot of needs that we need to meet, and we need to make sure that we're raising the revenue to meet them.
Doug, what's your take on that? Are there fundamental assumptions that keep being made that should be jettisoned?
I am sadly far too familiar with the budget forecasting process in Massachusetts, and what I'll say is it's a challenge in any year. What we saw from 2019, 2020, and on forward, we saw the state's tax collections grow by 40% in a 2-year period. So in FY21 and FY22, tax collections grew by 40%. Guess what? Our revenue projections at the time lowballed that by billions and billions of dollars, right? And so now the question coming out of FY22 was, what's going to happen? Are we going to keep all this revenue? The consensus was we're not. We're going to give some of it back. So how does that happen? Does that happen slowly? Does it happen all at once? And what I think you've seen in both last year's budget projections and this year's is a recognition of the fact that we know that tax collections are going to slow down. Thankfully, during the pandemic and during those great revenue growth years, the state did some really good fiscal things in terms of socking money away, and I think also investing at the same time. And so there are always things that can be improved in terms of the budget setting process. I would say from a context setting standpoint, you're talking about a $40 billion budget base, right? To date, year to date, we were $779 million below benchmark. And then just one clarification. People use a lot of terms. We are actually, tax revenues have grown over last year. They're below the expectation.
Thank you.
And then the other quick point of clarification I would just say is the tax relief package that's been out there, this downgrade has nothing to do with that. So the tax relief package was fully baked into the budget. This downgrade is based off of a revenue projection that had already priced in that tax relief. So just so folks are aware kind of how it works.
Right. But at the same time, that money would have been in hand were it not for the tax cut package, right? It probably then would have been spent on something else.
But that's the critical point, right?
It wouldn't just be kept to scale.
Exactly. So the tax package is scored this year at about $580 million.
Okay.
And really that gets to those spending and tax decisions. And I would just say, if the decision had been made by the House, Senate, and administration to not use that for tax relief, it would have been spent. It would not be available to offset this.
You've got about 15 seconds to answer this. 10 seconds.
Yes.
State House News Service reported recently the Senate's going to redouble its push for free community college for all Massachusetts residents. Is this diminishment in projected revenues, the fact that they're not coming in, should it make the legislature hold off on new programs like that, do you think, for the next few months?
I think free community college is an important thing to do. They don't ask for new revenue when they want to cut taxes, so I don't think that they should suddenly use that as their reason to not make important expansions.
Okay, fair enough. Jonathan Cohn, Doug Howgate, thank you both. Appreciate it.